So we're going to talk about foreclosure and bankruptcy, and we're going to talk about it from a few different viewpoints. One, of course, is for the person who is facing it, but also for anybody who is a real estate investor, a real estate agent. What are the things that we can do and say? And I know you are in the state of Florida, so you have a very different viewpoint than some of the other states.
Welcome to the Jennifer J. Hammond Podcast. Jennifer is a licensed realtor, educator, speaker, and best-selling author. Jennifer's goal is to help you find your yay in every day.
So we have Sean Yesner here. He is an attorney who he understands. Okay, good. Yes. So there's the echo. Whew. We finally made it on now. So we're going to talk about foreclosure and bankruptcy, and we're going to talk about it from a few different viewpoints. One, of course, is for the person who is facing it, but also for anybody who is a real estate investor, a real estate agent. What are the things that we can do and say? And I know you are in the state of Florida, so you have a very different viewpoint than some of the other states. And so we should say that disclosure. You're a lawyer licensed in Florida. Are you licensed in any other states or just Florida?
Just Florida.
Florida's big enough. It's a pretty big state for all things. So I have to ask, first of all, why did you get into this kind of specialty, foreclosure and bankruptcy law? Is there a story there?
There is. It's not a very exciting story, but there is a story there. I graduated from undergrad with a degree in accounting, and my father's a CPA. And so I thought I always wanted to go to law school, but if I didn't, maybe I could transition the CPA, become a CPA. And so I went into law school wanting to be a tax attorney. I came out of law school wanting to be a litigator and be in the courtroom and scrap it out with other attorneys. And the first guy that offered me a job was a real estate attorney. So I fell into real estate. So after a few years working in real estate, I got a job at what we would call a foreclosure mill, representing lenders, and fell in love with it. So it's not something that I ever thought I'd be doing when I started my career, but it's an area of the law that fascinates me.
And it's complicated. To me, it's like the math problem. If you put this together in this city, if you do this checklist and that checklist, and unfortunately, it's something that we need to understand better all the time. I mean, foreclosure and bankruptcy, unfortunately, we see it happening. And I know that, we had a bunch of them back in 08, 09, 2010. And now I think coming around the corner, we're just finishing out 2021. And so now as I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, what do you think the prediction is? Do you think there will be some more than this year as far as bankruptcy and foreclosures?
Well, so back in 2008, when people kept saying we need to stop foreclosures, what occurred to me is that we're never going to stop foreclosures, unfortunately. What we've got to do is stop the things that cause foreclosure. So when we stop people from getting divorced, when we stop people from getting sick, when we stop people from losing their jobs, then we'll stop foreclosures. And that stuff's never going to happen. So we take a realistic approach and say, okay, let's help as many people as we can who find themselves in these financial situations. We had during COVID, we had all these moratoriums on foreclosures and evictions and all that kind of stuff. A lot of those are over or ending. And so I do think foreclosures might tick up a little bit. The good news is I don't think we're going to have the wave of foreclosures that people have predicted. I don't think we're going to have the bubble that we had in 2008, 9, 10. I think foreclosures probably are going to stay at an economically healthy level, if that makes sense.
I'm curious on why you think that.
Because we're still in a place where we're recovering from COVID, and I know there's a ton of opinions there, but as we start to get control of COVID, as we start to return back to normal, I analogize it to, especially living here in Florida when all the hurricanes come through. we had Hurricane Irma, I think it was 3-4 years ago. And when Hurricane Irma came through, the banks in Florida said, well, if you were impacted by Hurricane Irma, we're going to do a streamline loan modification for you. And so I applied for one and I got one, and it was easy and it was quick. And so I think that the banks are going to do the same thing as we begin to emerge from COVID. And to a certain extent, they already are. They're going to make the standards for getting a modification less. They're going to take longer before they start foreclosure, especially if someone who's having trouble making their payments claims COVID as a reason. So I think that's probably going to have a little bit to do with it. Plus, we're Fed is still keeping interest rates low, although they're starting to tick up. And there's a bunch of other economic factors there. So I think the government's going to keep control where we sort of ease back into a higher level of foreclosures.
I think you're right in the fact that the government, I think, is much more prepared than they were before. I think last time they were so blindsided. Now they're really sitting to figure out how can we make this as easy as possible as far as streamlining it, and in so many different ways. So now, do you work with consumers who are facing foreclosures and bankruptcy, or do you only work with banks and lenders?
So I worked at that foreclosure firm for about 3 years, and I was able to get a really good education on how to do all aspects of the foreclosure lawsuit from the lender perspective. You know, litigated cases, uncontested cases, evictions, bankruptcies, the whole 9 yards. In 2004, that firm shut down. The owner said, I don't want to do this anymore, and closed down the law firm. And that's when I hung my shingle and went off on my own and switched sides. So I would say the majority of my practice right now is defending foreclosures and helping people save their homes. But that's where you mentioned real estate investors. That's where the investors come in. And I still do handle plaintiff foreclosures for private investors, seller finance people that use their IRAs to loan money, that kind of stuff. I still do handle some plaintiff foreclosure cases, but probably the majority of it is defense. But I still handle both.
Yeah. So let's start there. So if somebody is actually facing foreclosure and they came in to talk to you, I know you kind of go through an interview with people with foreclosure. So let's start kind of wandering through when someone first sits down with you, what are the things that you're looking for, and how does that first initial interview go?
The first thing I'm going to ask them is, what do they want to do? Do they want to keep the house and save the house? Or do they want to get rid of the house? It's interesting right now. We find one of the reasons I don't think we're going to have a repeat of what happened in 2008 is because people have equity in their homes, or a lot more people have equity in their homes today than they did back in 2008. And so I've actually had foreclosure cases that started pre-COVID, and now And at the time they started, the homeowner was in a negative equity position, but now their home has equity. And so they're able to sell their home, pull that money, and either buy something else or rent or do whatever they're going to do. So I think we're going to get to a situation where a lot more people can sell and are able to sell and are able to get some money from the sale of their home. So I think, or the first question I ask is, what do you want to do? Do you want to save it? And that leads us to some options, or do you want to get rid of it? And that leads us to other options.
So let's talk about that. If they want to save it, what are some of the options? I mean, obviously there's been this moratorium for a year and a half now, where people haven't had to pay their mortgage. But now if they're still struggling and they're not sure what to do, but they really want to save it, what kind of options in the state of Florida do they have?
Probably the first best option is a loan modification. And lenders have loosened up their requirements to get a modification. Mm-hmm. And they're, like I said, with the Hurricane Irma and some of those other programs, I think the lenders have learned and probably would or should open that up countrywide. But the first best option is a loan modification. Assuming the borrower has a job, has the income to support the modification, to support the payments. What I like to tell people is that the lenders have a ton of options. They can reduce the principal balance that's owed. They can increase the amortization time period. They can extend the loan out to a 30 or 40-year time period. They can take the arrears and put them at the back of the loan. They can drop the interest rate. The question is, or the trick to a loan modification is, what will they do? There's all the stuff they can do, but what will they do? And so that's, I think, the first easiest option is modify the loan.
Yeah. And I think that what you just said is really important, is because I was just going to ask you to define. So many people, one thing I learned from, just 25 years now in real estate is that most people don't understand or have a wrong definition for what a term that we kind of throw around all the time is, like a loan modification. They think it's one thing, and I think the explanation of that is just what you just said. It could mean a lot of different things depending on what the lender decides, like putting the payments that you have on the back of the loan, or stretching out the amortization. So loan modification, I'm curious, if you could define it in one sentence, what would you say?
It is its own definition. So one of my pet peeves is when people call it a loan remodification.
Oh.
Well, when you put remodification, that implies it's a second modification. We're remodifying. It hasn't ever been modified before in most cases. So it's a modification of the terms of the loan. And that's, the term defines itself almost.
And I was going to say, and that I think for people, like you just said, it could define on how much your payment is, which when you just said the first question that you ask people is if you want to stay in your home. If you want to stay in your home, then it may be that it's the payment that you need to be lowered, or it's the interest rate that you need to be lowered, or that, again, like stretching out the amortization. So in one way or another, you're changing the terms of the original mortgage to something different, but it's very different than a refinance. And I think that's part of where I've seen people confuse a loan modification with a refinance, because with a refinance, you are changing the terms as well.
Yeah, with a refinance, you're getting an entirely new loan. You get a new loan that replaces the old loan. And I think refinancing is an option, but it's a very, very difficult option because there were no payments on the old loan. Now, one interesting thing that came up, all the lenders have given forbearances and the moratoriums have given forbearances. And I can't stand forbearances because a forbearance doesn't cure the loan. A forbearance doesn't fix the payment default. All a forbearance does is it says, while you make whatever payments you're going to make, whether those payments are $0 or $1,000 or whatever the number happens to be, while you're making those payments, the bank is going to forbear. The bank's not going to take action that they're otherwise able to take. So they're not going to foreclose or do anything like that. But the forbearance doesn't catch up what you're behind. Now, what the government said, and some of the stuff that came into place during COVID, the forbearance in this circumstance is not going to count against your credit. But the lenders are going to say you weren't making your payments because you were on a forbearance. And because you weren't making your payments, we as the refinancing lender have no payment history on which to qualify you for a new loan. So refinancing could be another option, but I think it's one of the more difficult options. You're either going to have a ton of equity and find like a hard money lender, like a private lender, and someone that uses their IRA to loan money. You're not going to be able to get, if you're on a forbearance, you're probably not going to be able to get a refinance from the traditional Bank of America, Wells Fargo, those guys. So it's an option, but I don't like it as an option.
Right. And I was going to say, and that's why I want to kind of talk through the different options. Just like you said, the first thing you ask somebody when they sit down at your law firm or via Zoom, since we live in a virtual world these days, is what do they want to do? If they want to keep the house or if they want to. So now we've talked about them keeping the house and, the options of loan modifications, refinance, hard but possible in certain circumstances. So what about if they decide, okay, I am going to go ahead with the foreclosure. What is that process like in Florida?
There's one other option, which I know we're going to get into later, which is bankruptcy. So we can sort of save that option for later because that's an entirely different discussion. But yeah, the foreclosure process in Florida is what's called a judicial state. So the foreclosure has to run through the court system. Now that's different from a non-judicial state, which is where there is no court or judge necessarily involved. The foreclosure is based on the documentation. In those cases, it's not necessarily a mortgage. Sometimes it's a trustee, a deed of trust instead of a mortgage. And so the mortgage company just files certain documents and papers, and the foreclosure is a relatively faster process, and it's all document driven. Versus Florida, we're still relying on the court system and judges and hearings and motions and all of that stuff to get the foreclosure through. So the timeline is still taking a year to a year and a half. And that's still, there's issues with COVID. There's issues with coming out of COVID. There's issues with getting rid of the backlog that was created when everything went on pause during the moratorium. So those factors are still playing in. There's factors of the lenders can't start a foreclosure until they've given the borrower an opportunity to try to modify. They've got to wait. I think it's 4 months from the default date and send out the notices and whatnot. So there's still massive delays in Florida. But the general timeline, you got the service of the lawsuit, and the borrower has 20 days to respond. And then there's a potential for mediation within the foreclosure process, which again is to see if we can modify the loan. So you can try to modify the loan prior to the foreclosure being filed, be unsuccessful, have the foreclosure get filed, and then get another chance to try to modify the loan through the state court foreclosure process. Once that's done, the bank can then file its paperwork and ask the judge for a final judgment. And then if the judge grants the final judgment at a hearing, which it takes 25 to 30 days between the time the motion is filed and the time there's a hearing. And then the judge will, if the bank is successful, the judge grants their foreclosure sale date, which under Florida law is between 28 to 35 days from the hearing date. Now, in there, like I said, we can file a motion to get an extension of time to file a response to the lawsuit. We can ask for longer than a 35-day sale date at the judgment hearing date. It depends on how crowded the judge's dockets are in terms of how quickly they can get time on the calendar for the hearing. I mentioned the mediation process to see if we can get a loan modification again. So there's all kinds of points during that process. We can insert legitimate defenses. Now, one thing that's occurred based on 2008, there were a whole bunch of defenses that we could insert into the foreclosure process. The securitization of the loan, the whether the lender had filed all the proper assignments, whether the lender had filed all the proper notices prior to serving its foreclosure lawsuit. There were all these forensic audits of the way the mortgage was originated. There's all this stuff going on. A lot of those defenses have largely been eliminated through case law, judge law, appeals, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of those defenses really don't apply anymore, but we can still insert some stuff and slow this process way down. I tell clients that if they don't hire an attorney, they're probably looking at something in the 9-month range, give or take, unless the bank's attorney really gets aggressive. If they hire an attorney, typically we can push it out a year and a half, sometimes even longer than that. Now, again, it's hard for me to make promises because every case is different. Every fact pattern is different and those kinds of disclaimers, but we can still delay things with an eye towards helping these people accomplish their goal, whether it's saving their home or getting rid of their home. Let's delay things to allow them to do that.
And that, I think that's the one thing that, again, is so different from state to state. And as you mentioned before, judicial versus non-judicial states is also something that a lot of times people don't understand, that depending on the state you're in, you need to understand the process so that it's not confused. And when you have a judicial state, that means that in some ways, I think it just gives a lot more options versus non-judicial states, right? Would you consider that to be true?
I think so. One of the biggest fears that people have when they come to see me is, will the sheriff knock on my door tomorrow and kick me out of the house? In a judicial state, that's not going to happen without a lot of documents. You're going to get all the motions and you're going to get all that, the hearing dates and all that kind of stuff. So it could happen, but you're going to get a ton of paperwork before it happens. In a non-judicial state, I think the same thing. You're going to get a lot of paperwork, but it could potentially happen a little bit faster. So, but no, the biggest fear people have is, will the sheriff show up tomorrow and throw me out? And no, that's typically not going to happen.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's one of those basic questions that, again, people ask all the time. There are some pretty interesting challenges that we've all faced, but